All right, let's jump right into this explainer. When we think of world history, we usually picture this stoic saga of heroes, brilliant tacticians, and grand sweeping destinies. But what if we completely reframe it? What if history is actually just a fast-paced, highly dysfunctional corporate environment driven entirely by petty middle managers? Today, we're going to explore the workplace comedy of empires, where world leaders act less like these untouchable demigods and way more like stubborn go-getters totally obsessed with office politics.
To really set the stage here, I want you to travel back with me to 14th century Italy. Picture this. A town crier steps up to the square and announces, "Good news and bad news. The bad news is a plague that will wipe out half of Europe. The good news is we've got a new bucket for the city well." And the crowd, they literally go wild. This perfectly captures the utterly absurd priorities of historical management. A trivial victory, a literal bucket, completely overshadows an impending world-altering catastrophe.
Which brings us to the ultimate corporate turf war, Rome versus Carthage in the First Punic War. I want you to think of these two empires not as majestic ancient states, but as rival megacorporations fighting a brutal war over Mediterranean market share. Carthage was the established corporate monopoly. They had this massive, wealthy fleet. Rome, on the other hand, they were the aggressive startup with zero naval experience. Rome was basically full of total stubborn noobs just making things up as they went, trying to overthrow the established punks of the sea.
And speaking of the sea, 80%. Let that number sink in. That is the staggering amount of the Roman fleet wiped out in a single, devastating storm. Imagine a modern company losing 80% of its assets overnight. As many as 100,000 men drowned because a Roman executive essentially wanted to laugh in the face of Mother Nature. Now, for literally any normal nation, this is a crippling bankruptcy. You sue for peace, right? But Rome wasn't normal.
So, the absolutely crucial point is how Rome processed this failure. Step 1, they built a massive war fleet. Step 2, they lost it completely to a storm. And their logical conclusion for step 3? Just ignore the gods and build another one in 3 months. This is the terrifying logic of Roman determination. To them, treating catastrophic losses was exactly like respawning in a video game. A nation isn't vanquished if they simply refuse to admit defeat. They were the ultimate stubborn losers who just kept building new fleets.
But even with endless respawns, the average frontline worker really struggled. Like, how does a noob general actually practice driving tanks and flying aircraft straight? During these massive wars, you had soldiers, let's call him Steve, complaining he's a total noob whose vehicles just keep getting blown up. If only Steve had access to the free-to-play online multiplayer combat game War Thunder. With over 2,000 incredibly detailed vehicles spanning 100 years of military development, Steve could finally practice his tactics. And just like Steve, you can become one with the machine using the promo code in the historical archives to get your exclusive decals.
All right, pivoting back to our historical executives, consider the educational irony of the captured Roman consul, Regulus. His motto? You never break a promise, that's too far. See, Regulus made a deal with Carthage to negotiate peace in Rome, or return to Carthage to be tortured. So he goes to Rome, tells them to keep fighting, and then willingly heads right back to Carthage to die. His colleagues were begging him to break the deal, literally reminding him, hey, we massacre entire populations on a regular basis. But for Regulus, breaking a verbal contract was just unthinkable.
This exact kind of opportunism built directly into the next phase of their corporate rivalry: vengeance and free real estate. So after Rome eventually wins the First Punic War, Carthage has these unpaid mercenaries who revolt on the island of Sardinia. Rome instantly swoops in, looks at the map, and basically shouts, "Hot diggity dog! That's free real estate!" They just claim the territory right out from under a weakened Carthage, acting completely, ruthlessly, opportunistically.
And it actually gets worse for the Carthaginian balance sheet. Rome acted like the absolute worst kind of micromanaging corporate overlord. First, they demanded Carthage leave Sicily and pay 2,200 silver talents over 20 years. Then, right at the finish line, Rome's management is like, wait, actually, scratch that, changed our minds, you now owe 3,200 silver talents over 10 years. It was an absurdly punishing, arbitrary shakedown that completely humiliated Carthage and planted all the seeds for the sequel.
Which perfectly explains the mental state of Carthage's top executive, Hamilcar Barca. If you look at his brain allocation, it's incredibly skewed. A staggering 98% of his thoughts were dedicated entirely to revenge against Rome, leaving a measly 2% for actually exploring Spain. Instead of being this stoic, rational general, Hamilcar is the ultimate petty leader. His entire existence, and the way he raised his son Hannibal, was reallocated to a bloodthirsty obsession with just getting even.
But here's the kicker. If you're planning a massive corporate takeover and a bloodthirsty revenge spree in Spain, you run into a huge problem. How do you hide it from Roman spies? Well, if Hamilcar and Hannibal wanted true privacy from Roman snoops trying to steal their data and give them scaly dreams, they desperately needed NordVPN. With secure servers worldwide, NordVPN encrypts your data so rival empires can't track your movements across the Alps or steal your siege plans. It's literally the ultimate tool for the privacy-conscious ancient general.
Now, what actually happens when you hire a competent contractor in this era? The First Punic War gives us a classic showdown, the successful go-getter general versus the jealous corporate politicians. Carthage brought in a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus. This guy completely restructured their army, put the elephants up front, and literally saved the company by crushing the Romans. His reward? He was immediately forced to flee because the local politicians got horribly jealous of his success. It is office politics at its absolute worst.
Okay, let's fast forward a few centuries and dive into another classic workplace power struggle. The Middle Ages were completely defined by the investiture controversy. Forget epic holy wars for a second. This was fundamentally a massive HR dispute between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor over who had the actual authority to hire and fire local bishops across Europe.
And the back and forth here got incredibly, hilariously childish. You had the Pope shouting, "You're deposed," and the Holy Roman Emperor snapping right back, "No, you're deposed." They literally tried to fire each other from their respective divine positions. It was this insanely petty conflict where the emperor would invest his own family members into church roles, the pope would excommunicate him, and it resulted in centuries of tribal infighting over arbitrary things, like which side of your cap you wear a feather on.
A huge part of this conflict centered on a little thing called simony. This is the act of selling powerful church positions to the highest bidder for personal riches, basically paying your way into upper management. And as we all know, buying a bishopric is incredibly expensive. But you know how you could save money on your medieval bribery? With the Honey promo code. By automatically finding the best deals at checkout, Honey ensures you never overpay when securing your eternal power.
All right, let's shift gears to a completely different kind of empire, leaping forward to 19th and 20th century Russia. And just to be clear, we're going to look strictly at the mechanics of the power struggle here between the archaic monarchy and the rising revolutionaries. Russia was this massive, feudal corporate structure that was falling far behind its modernizing European competitors. And the management style at the top dictated absolutely everything that followed.
The contrast between the two CEOs of this era is just staggering. On one hand, you have Tsar Alexander III, known as the Great Repressor, who managed through strict, brutal authority and used secret police to crush all opposition. And then you have his son, Tsar Nicholas II, who his own father bluntly referred to as a timid, girly girl. Nicholas was completely unprepared for leadership. He was an executive who much preferred playing with his friends and hiding from conflict over managing a rapidly collapsing empire.
So, how did this lack of leadership actually cascade into total structural failure? Well, in 1904, management launches a distraction war with Japan just to boost morale, which they humiliatingly lose. By January 1905, a peaceful protest asking for basic rights ends in the tragic Bloody Sunday. By October, facing total collapse, Nicholas issues this desperate manifesto sharing power with the Duma. But post-1905, Nicholas immediately ignores the shared power and goes right back to doing whatever he wants. Avoiding structural modernization directly fueled unstoppable unrest.
Meanwhile, the opposition was dealing with its own absurd office politics. The Marxist Party split into the Bolsheviks, meaning majority, and the Mensheviks, meaning minority. But what's absolutely fascinating is that this monumental split was allegedly caused by Vladimir Lenin refusing to yield an inch on trivial, petty arguments. We're talking debates as silly as whether cereal is a soup. This historical irony shows how one man's completely uncompromising attitude over minor squabbles ultimately shaped the factions of global communism.
And how did you climb the corporate ladder in this revolutionary faction? Well, a young Joseph Stalin proved himself to Lenin as a real go-getter, not through meticulous spreadsheets, but through a literal crime spree for fundraising. We're talking kidnapping, extorting, bribing, bank raiding, and assassinations. It was violent, chaotic, rapid-fire loyalty building that secured his position as a crucial, unquestioning asset to the Bolshevik Party.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this explainer. Beneath all the grand titles, the epic wars, and the towering historical monuments, are we all just taking orders from history's petty middle managers? Whether we're looking at the stubborn noobs of Rome, the revenge-obsessed executives of Carthage, or the internal squabbles of Imperial Russia,
History is so often driven by stubborn losers, jealous politicians, and absurdly petty human flaws. It's a fascinating and honestly somewhat hilarious lens to view our past through. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.